maybe now is a good time to explain diabetes, kind of high level stuff. We can differentiate the difference between type 1 and type 2, but for the listener, can you explain what diabetes is, what is going on, and you're throwing things out like blood glucose and insulin and all these terms that I think most people get them really confused. They know there's an association, right? If I hear diabetes, I do think glucose, I think insulin, but it's harder to remember, like, is this the hormone? Do I eat insulin? What's going on? Like, can you give us a good rundown of what diabetes is?
Okay, so diabetes is a condition where your body has become unable, and this is diabetes in general, your body has become unable to process or metabolize carbohydrates. And carbohydrates are foods that convert into glucose in your body. So carbohydrates are your bread, fruits as well, all fruits, starches like starchy vegetables like potatoes. Most root vegetables are carbohydrates. And in fact, all plant foods are carbohydrates. I have to say that. But if the carbohydrate content, for example, is very low, like in cucumbers, then you're okay. You can eat that. It's not going to have a dramatic effect on your blood sugars. But all the other carbohydrates like sugars, starches, will convert into glucose. And then your body will release the hormone insulin. So your pancreas actually will release insulin, and insulin's job is to reach your bloodstream, if you like, and remove the glucose or the sugar from your bloodstream, because sugar cannot stay in your bloodstream. It's very toxic if it does. In fact, it's fatal. So if your blood sugar rises too high, then it could be a fatal condition. So it's toxic to your body. So insulin will reach out to your bloodstream, remove the glucose, and spread it around into your cells for energy, for fuel. Glucose can be used for fuel by your cells. Now, the problem with type 1 diabetics is that their pancreas cannot produce any insulin. So insulin is a very important, in fact, it's a vital hormone. None of us can live without insulin. So the pancreas can no longer produce insulin. The pancreas either doesn't produce any insulin or it doesn't produce sufficient insulin in type 1s. So then type 1 diabetics will have to either take injections, daily injections of insulin, or of course use some technology like insulin pumps, which is something I use myself, where well, I can talk about the pump later. But so now the question your audience might be wondering about is, why do type 1 diabetics no longer produce insulin? Well, type 1 diabetes is an autoimmune condition. I have to emphasize that. And most people don't know that. Type 1 diabetes is an autoimmune condition where your own body damages, mistakenly obviously, damages your own pancreatic cells that produce insulin. So the cells in the pancreas that produce insulin are called beta cells. So the beta cells produce insulin. But in type 1s, for whatever reason, the immune system has actually destroyed the pancreatic cells that produce insulin, thinking that they're not good for the body. So it's an autoimmune condition. So now type 2 diabetes is not an autoimmune condition. Type 2 diabetes is a completely different condition where the pancreas produces insulin. In fact, in most cases, the pancreas produces too much insulin. But because of insulin resistance, because of years of hyperinsulinemia, or because of years of running very high on insulin, the cells in a type 2 diabetic person no longer respond to the insulin. So insulin carries the glucose and reaches out to the cells and knocks on the cell wall to tell them, hey, I brought you more glucose, but the cells are already overflowing. They're already full of glucose. They no longer respond to insulin. So what happens is that in a type 2 diabetic, then that glucose has nowhere to go. It can't go to the cells because the cells aren't responding to insulin. So it stays in the bloodstream. So their blood sugar starts rising. And then obviously, perhaps in annual check, in most cases in annual checks, people find out that they are diabetic because the sugar in their blood is too high. So because that sugar, that glucose has nowhere to go. So it's a condition, type 2 diabetes is a condition of insulin resistance, where the pancreas does produce insulin, but then the cells in the body aren't responding to insulin. In some cases, of course, if that insulin resistance lasts for a long period of time, in some cases, the pancreas gets damaged. So you get pancreatic damage, in which case then the pancreas stops producing insulin too. But type 2 diabetes is a very different condition from type 1 diabetes. Type 2 diabetes is reversible. You can put it into remission by not eating carbohydrates. If you're not eating carbohydrates, then you're not going to have glucose in your body. And if your pancreas is already producing insulin, eventually your cells will start responding to the insulin. So it's a completely reversible disease in most people, in most type 2 diabetics. Type 1 diabetes, there's no cure for it, and you cannot reverse it. The only way you can manage type 1 currently is by controlling your diet, lowering your carbohydrates, and taking daily insulin injections.
Gotcha. Wow, you did such a good job of explaining both of those things and telling us what they had in common, but also what separates them. So can you tell us, uncontrolled for both people, like let's go back to your diagnosis at age 5. Let's say this is 150 years ago. We don't have insulin. What is the end game of that person versus the end game of type 2 diabetes uncontrolled? What ends up unfolding to the point of morbidity, I guess?
Well, uncontrolled type 1 diabetes, well, uncontrolled, I wouldn't say uncontrolled type 1 diabetes, untreated or type 1 diabetes without insulin. So what happened to type 1 diabetics before the discovery of insulin was that they would just wither away, literally. I mean, type 1 diabetic children, most of them were diagnosed as children. They would literally just wither away and die. Within a month or 2, at most 3. They would be in bed. They would end up bedbound and die within 3 months.
Quick.
Very quick. So now type 2 diabetics, however, even 150 years ago, type 2 diabetics were treated with a low carbohydrate diet. Their diet was meat, eggs, butter, dairy. It was in medical books. Type 2 diabetes, people knew even a century ago that you could keep it under control, or you could even put it into remission if you avoid the carbohydrates. So now, if obviously type 2 diabetes isn't controlled, the implications, and even poorly controlled type 1 diabetes, even type 1 diabetics who are on insulin, but they're not able to control their blood sugars properly, the complications are disastrous for both. And they're very similar, very, very similar complications. So neuropathy, losing limbs, blindness. I mean, people younger than 20 years younger, the people in their 30s are losing their sight because of uncontrolled blood sugars. Of course, cognitive impairment, dementia, Heart attack, right? Heart disease is prevalent among diabetics. Kidney disease. So most people, I don't know the exact number, but it's a very big percentage, like something like 80% of people in dialysis wards are actually diabetics. So every organ within your body, if your blood sugars aren't controlled, whether you're type 1 or 2, if they're not well controlled, every organ will eventually fail.